You promised you'd come back, the maid's toddler said. The billionaire went silent. Hey, listen, before you go anywhere, I need you to hear this one till the end. A 3-year-old girl stood in a marble hallway, pointed her tiny finger at a man in a $30,000 suit, and said 6 words that made a billionaire forget how to speak. He had faced boardrooms, lawsuits, and men who wanted to destroy his company. But nothing had ever silenced him like this. What she said next would change both of their lives forever. And by the end of this story, you might understand exactly why. Hey, welcome back to the channel, my friend. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from today, and which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing where this family comes from. Today's story is one of the most emotional ones we've told, about grief, guilt, and a little girl who healed a broken man without even knowing it. Stay with me. This one gets deep. The house didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum that happened to have a bed in it. Ethan Cole was 34 years old, and by every measure the world used to judge success, he had already won. His company, Coalfield Technologies, was worth more than some small countries' entire economies. He had a mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, with 12 bedrooms he never used, a garage with cars he never drove, and a staff of people who kept the whole operation running so smoothly that Ethan himself barely had to think about his own life. That was exactly how he liked it. Thinking about his life was the one thing Ethan Cole tried never to do. He left for the office before 6 every morning and came home after 10 most nights, when the house was dark and quiet and safe. Safe because there was no one awake to look at him with concern. No one to ask if he was okay. No one to remind him of anything. Maria Torres had been the head housekeeper at the Cole estate for 8 months. She was 30 years old, quiet, hardworking, and carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from surviving things most people never have to survive. She rarely spoke about her past. All anyone on staff knew was that she was raising her daughter alone, and that she showed up every single day, rain or shine, with the little girl in tow because she had no one else to watch her. The little girl's name was Sophia. She had just turned 3. Sophia had curly dark hair that her mother tied up every morning into a small, bouncing puff, warm brown eyes, and a habit that unsettled the household staff more than they ever said out loud. Every single morning, when Ethan left for work, Sophia would run to the front hallway, plant herself by the enormous oak door, and watch him go. She never cried. She never made a scene. She just watched, with a seriousness far too heavy for a 3-year-old's face. On this particular Tuesday morning, Ethan was moving fast, checking his phone, already 3 emails deep into a crisis before his coffee had even cooled. He barely registered the small shape standing by the door until he was almost past her. Mr. Cole. Sophia's voice was small but clear. He stopped. He hadn't expected her to speak to him. In 8 months, she never had. He looked down. Sophia looked up at him with those enormous brown eyes, lifted her small hand, and pointed one finger directly at his chest. You promised you'd come back. Ethan felt something crack open in his ribcage that he had spent 3 years welding shut. He hadn't promised her anything. He barely knew this child's name. And yet the words landed in him like they'd been fired from somewhere much closer, much older, much more painful than a toddler in his front hallway could possibly know. I'm sorry. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Sophia didn't repeat herself. She simply stood there, hands still raised, waiting, as if she expected an answer that mattered. From down the hall, Maria appeared, her face flushing with embarrassment as she rushed forward. Sophia, baby, come here, let Mr. Cole go to work. She scooped her daughter up gently, murmuring an apology to Ethan. I'm so sorry, sir. She says things sometimes. She doesn't always know what she means. Ethan stood frozen for a moment longer than was comfortable. His driver was waiting. His first meeting started in 40 minutes. There were 1,000 reasons to simply nod and walk out the door like he did every single day. Instead, he asked the one question he hadn't planned on asking. Does she say that to a lot of people? Maria hesitated, shifting Sophia on her hip. Just, people who leave. Her father left before she was born, Mr. Cole. I think she watches everyone go, and part of her is always waiting for someone to actually come back and mean it. Something about the way she said it, flat, practiced, like a wound she'd explained so many times it no longer bled when she touched it, made Ethan's chest tighten further. I see, he said, because he didn't know what else to say. He walked out to the car. He got in. He opened his phone to answer the emails piling up. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Cole didn't look at a single one during the entire 40-minute drive into Manhattan. He kept seeing a small finger pointed at his chest. He kept hearing a voice say 5 words he hadn't heard in 3 years, in a house he tried to seal shut like a tomb. You promised you'd come back. That night, Ethan came home at 11:15. Later than usual. He told himself it was because of the merger negotiations running long. The truth was he'd sat in his office for 2 extra hours, staring at a framed photograph in his bottom desk drawer that he hadn't looked at in months. When he walked through the front door, the house was dark, except for a single light on in the kitchen. He almost walked past it. Instead, something pulled him toward it. Maria was there, folding a small stack of Sophia's laundry at the kitchen island, the little girl asleep on the small pull-out cot in the staff break room down the hall, visible through the cracked door. You're still here, Ethan said, surprised. Sophia's daycare fell through today, Maria said quietly, not looking up from the folding. I didn't have anyone else. I know it's against policy to bring her, sir. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. It's fine, Ethan said, before he even decided to say it. Maria looked up at him, startled. Ethan glanced toward the cracked door, toward the small sleeping shape under a blanket 2 sizes too big for her. What she said this morning, he said slowly. Does she say that to everyone who leaves? Or just men? Maria's hands stilled on the laundry. For a long moment, she said nothing. Just men who look like they're carrying something heavy, she finally said. I don't know how she knows. But she always knows. Ethan didn't answer. He simply nodded once, turned, and walked toward his study, the words settling into him like stones dropped into still water, sinking slow, but sinking deep. He didn't know it yet, but the walls he'd spent 3 years building were about to come down, one small, fearless fingerpoint at a time. The next morning, Ethan found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He walked slower. He left his bedroom at his usual time, but instead of striding straight past the front hallway toward the door, he paused. Sophia was there again, exactly where she'd been the day before, her small hand already resting on the wall beside the door like she was keeping guard over it. She didn't say anything this time. She just watched him with those same serious eyes. I'm going to work, Ethan said, awkwardly, the way a man speaks when he hasn't spoken to a small child in a very long time. I'll be back tonight. Sophia tilted her head, studying him like she was deciding whether to believe him. Okay, she said simply, and that was it. No dramatic reaction. No tears. Just quiet, cautious acceptance, like she'd learned long ago not to expect too much from promises. It shouldn't have affected him the way it did. But Ethan sat in the back of his car that morning with his jaw tight and his eyes stinging in a way he refused to acknowledge. Over the following 2 weeks, something shifted in the Cole household, subtly at first. Ethan began coming home earlier, not every night, but more nights than not. He told himself it was because the merger had calmed down. The staff noticed otherwise. He started noticing small things. The crayon drawings that occasionally appeared taped to the refrigerator, clearly Sophia's work, all wild circles and unidentifiable shapes that Maria always described with more patience than the drawings probably deserved. He noticed that Sophia had a stuffed rabbit with one ear chewed nearly off that she carried everywhere. He noticed that Maria hummed softly while she worked, an old melody he couldn't place but that tugged at something in his memory every time he heard it. He also noticed Vanessa's reaction, the first time she came to the house and saw Sophia's small shoes lined up by the back door. Vanessa Whitfield was Ethan's fiancée of 8 months, a poised, polished woman from a family nearly as wealthy as his own, the kind of match that made perfect sense on paper and in the society pages. She was beautiful, sharp, ambitious, and entirely uninterested in anything that didn't serve a clear purpose in the life she was building for herself. A toddler's shoes by the back door did not serve a purpose. Whose are these? She asked, holding one up between 2 fingers like it might be contaminated. The housekeeper's daughter, Ethan said. She's here sometimes when childcare falls through. Vanessa's mouth pressed into a thin line. This is a professional household, Ethan, not a daycare. It's inappropriate. She's 3 years old, Vanessa. She's not filing a hostile takeover. Vanessa didn't laugh. It sets a precedent. Staff bringing their personal lives into your home. Into our home, soon. She set the shoe down with exaggerated care. I'll speak to the estate manager about tightening the household policy. Ethan felt an unfamiliar flicker of resistance rise in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time regarding Vanessa, or regarding much of anything. Don't, he said. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the pushback. Excuse me. Leave it alone. It's fine. She studied him for a long moment, something calculating passing behind her eyes, before she smiled thinly and let it go, for now. Of course, darling. Whatever you'd like. But Vanessa Whitfield was not a woman who let things go. She simply learned to wait. That weekend, Ethan found himself in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, a place he almost never was, since weekends were usually spent at the office or on calls with his Asia-Pacific division. Maria was there with Sophia, who was seated at the small kitchen table with a coloring book, her tongue poking out in concentration as she scribbled in green crayon. Mr. Cole, Maria said, startled. I didn't realize you'd be home. I can take her to the other room. It's fine, Ethan said, for what felt like the 10th time that week. He hesitated, then, feeling strange and out of practice, pulled out the chair across from Sophia and sat down. Sophia looked up at him, unbothered by his presence in a way that struck him as remarkable. Most adults in his life either wanted something from him or were afraid of him. Sophia was neither. What are you coloring? He asked. A dinosaur, Sophia said, holding up the page, which showed a green blob with what might have been intended as spikes. He's sad. Why is he sad? Sophia considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. Because everybody left him. Ethan's throat tightened unexpectedly. That's really sad. Yeah. Sophia went back to coloring, entirely unaware of the effect her words had just had on the man across the table. But he's gonna be okay. Somebody's gonna come back for him. They always do. Eventually. Ethan sat there in silence, watching a 3-year-old color a dinosaur, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel in 3 years, the dangerous, fragile beginning of hope. He didn't know yet what memory this child was slowly, unknowingly excavating in him. He didn't know that in 2 more weeks, a memory box in his study and a photograph he kept hidden would finally, unavoidably, come into the light. But some part of him, the part that had started walking slower down that hallway every morning, already sensed that his carefully sealed world was about to break wide open. It happened on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Sophia first pointed her finger at his chest. Ethan had come home at 7, early, by his standards, and found the house unusually quiet. Maria had already left for the day, her shift over, Sophia presumably home with her for the evening. He wandered through the empty rooms with a restlessness he couldn't name, until he found himself standing outside the door of a room he hadn't entered in over 3 years. The nursery. He'd told the staff to leave it exactly as it was. No one questioned it, though he was certain they whispered about it when they thought he couldn't hear. A 34-year-old bachelor billionaire with a fully furnished, untouched nursery in the west wing of his mansion. It probably sounded insane. It probably was insane. He pushed the door open. Pale yellow walls. A white crib with a mobile of tiny stars still hanging above it, unmoving, dust gathering in its corners. A rocking chair by the window. A small dresser with a lamp shaped like a moon. And on top of the dresser, a single framed photograph. Ethan crossed the room slowly, the way a man walks towards something he both needs and dreads, and picked it up. Claire. His wife. Laughing, sunlight catching her hair, holding a giggling toddler on her hip. A little girl with dark curls and enormous brown eyes, reaching one small hand toward the camera. Lily. His daughter would have been 6 years old now, if she had lived. If the car carrying her and Claire hadn't been struck by a delivery truck running a red light 3 years ago, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, while Ethan sat in a boardroom 40 minutes away, closing a deal that had felt, at the time, like the most important thing in the world. He had promised Lily that morning that he'd be home in time for her 3rd birthday dinner. He had a gift wrapped in the back seat of his car, a small stuffed rabbit, because she loved rabbits more than anything. He remembered her standing at the front door that morning exactly the way Sophia now stood there every day, small hand pressed to the wall, watching him go. You promise, Daddy? You promise you'll come back for my party? I promise, baby. Cross my heart. He never made it home. By the time the deal closed and he checked his phone, there were 14 missed calls, and a voicemail from the hospital that he had never been able to listen to all the way through, not once, in 3 years. He had buried his wife and daughter on a Thursday very much like this one. He had bought this house 4 months later, telling himself a fresh start would help, then filled it with staff and silence and worked 18-hour days so there would never be a single quiet moment in which grief could catch him standing still. And then a stranger's 3-year-old daughter had looked up at him with Lily's exact eyes and said the exact words that had haunted every single hour of every single day since that Thursday. "You promised you'd come back." Ethan sank into the rocking chair, the framed photograph still clutched in both hands, and for the first time in 3 years, he let himself cry, not the controlled, private grief he allowed himself in rare, unguarded moments, but the kind of grief that comes up from somewhere ancient and shakes the whole body. He didn't hear the door creak open behind him. He didn't hear the soft footsteps. "Mr. Cole." He turned, quickly wiping his face, mortified to find Maria standing in the doorway. She must have come back for something Sophia had forgotten. Her eyes moved from his tear-streaked face to the photograph in his hands, and understanding dawned slowly on her features. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, already backing toward the door. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'll go." "Wait." The word came out of him before he could stop it. Maria paused. "That's my daughter," Ethan said, his voice raw. "Lily. She would have been 6 this year. She and my wife." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Maria's hand rose to her mouth. "Oh, Mr. Cole. I had no idea. I'm so sorry." "Sophia looks like her," Ethan whispered, staring down at the photograph. "Not exactly, but something about her eyes. The way she watches me leave every morning." He let out a broken, humorless laugh. "The exact words she said to me. Lily said those same words to me the morning she died. I promised I'd be home for her birthday. I wasn't." Maria stood frozen in the doorway, absorbing the weight of what he'd just told her. 3 months of quiet observations about the strange, sad man she worked for suddenly rearranging themselves into a devastating new shape. "I think," she said carefully, stepping into the room, "that Sophia doesn't know any of this. She couldn't. She just feels things, sometimes, that other people can't explain. I don't think she meant to hurt you." "She didn't hurt me," Ethan said, and realized, even as he said it, that it was true in a strange and unexpected way. "She's the first thing in 3 years that's actually made me feel something other than numb." The two of them sat with that admission in silence, the last of the evening light fading through the nursery window, the mobile of tiny stars hanging motionless above an empty crib that had never once been slept in. Neither of them yet understood that this moment, grief finally spoken aloud after 3 years of silence, was the beginning of something that would change both of their lives, and Sophia's, forever. But 3 floors below, unseen by either of them, Vanessa Whitfield stood in the hallway with her phone in hand, having overheard just enough through a cracked door to begin quietly, methodically, planning her next move. Vanessa didn't say anything that night. She was far too smart for that. Instead, she waited 3 days, gathering information the way she gathered everything else in her life, quietly, strategically, with a cold and patient efficiency. She learned Maria's last name, her immigration status, her previous employment history, the fact that Sophia's father had abandoned them before the child was even born. She learned, through a conversation with the estate manager that seemed casual but was anything but, that Ethan had personally approved an exception to bring Sophia onto the property whenever Maria's childcare fell through. She learned enough to understand exactly what kind of threat she was dealing with. On Sunday evening, she arrived at the Cole estate unannounced, a bottle of wine in hand and a smile perfectly arranged on her face. "I thought we could have a quiet dinner," she said, kissing Ethan's cheek. "Just the 2 of us. We haven't had much time together lately." Ethan, who had spent the weekend in a strange, cautious lightness he hadn't felt in years, having taken Sophia and Maria, almost on impulse, to the small carnival that had set up in town, buying Sophia her first cotton candy and watching her eyes go wide with wonder at the Ferris wheel lights, agreed, sensing he owed Vanessa some attention he hadn't been giving her. Over dinner, she brought it up carefully, wrapped in concern rather than accusation. "I've been thinking," she said, swirling her wine, "about the housekeeper's little girl." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "What about her?" "I only mean this out of care for you, Ethan. I know Lily's death broke something in you. I've watched you carry that for 3 years." Her voice was soft, sympathetic, expertly calibrated. "But don't you think it's a little concerning, how attached you're becoming to this child? A stranger's daughter, standing in for the one you lost. That's not healing, darling. That's avoidance. That's a man refusing to actually grieve by finding a substitute instead. The words landed exactly where she intended them to land, on the rawest, most vulnerable nerve in Ethan's chest. That's not what this is, he said, though a flicker of doubt had already taken root. Isn't it? Vanessa reached across the table and took his hand, her thumb stroking gently over his knuckles. I want what's best for you. I want you to actually heal, not build another elaborate substitute to avoid feeling the real loss. And practically speaking, the housekeeper. Bringing her daughter to work, letting her wander the estate, letting you form this kind of bond with a child whose mother is your employee? It's a liability, Ethan. Emotionally and legally. What happens when Maria eventually leaves for another position, and that little girl disappears from your life the way everyone else has? Are you prepared to lose someone again? Ethan sat in silence for a long moment. The doubt Vanessa had planted was already sending roots deep into the soil of his grief, exactly as she'd intended. What are you suggesting? He finally asked. I'm suggesting we handle this with compassion, but also with clarity, Vanessa said gently. Perhaps it's time to consider a change in household staff. Someone more appropriate for the long term. I know a wonderful housekeeping agency, very discreet, very professional. No complications. She squeezed his hand. I only want to protect you, Ethan. I love you too much to watch you get hurt again. Ethan didn't agree to anything that night. But he didn't refuse outright either, and that hesitation, small as it seemed, was exactly the crack Vanessa had been looking for. The following Monday, Ethan was colder than he'd been in weeks. He left before Sophia was awake. He came home after she and Maria had already gone. When their paths did cross, on Wednesday morning, he offered Sophia only a stiff nod before hurrying past her toward the door, ignoring the small hand that lifted, ready to point. Sophia stood in the hallway long after the door closed, her hand slowly lowering, confusion crossing her small face. Maria appeared behind her, having watched the entire exchange from the kitchen doorway, and felt her stomach drop with a familiar, painful clarity. She'd seen this before. Men who got close, then panicked, then pulled away. She'd built her entire adult life around the lesson that closeness eventually cost you something you couldn't afford to pay. Come on, baby, she said softly, scooping Sophia up. Let's get you dressed. Did I do something wrong? Sophia asked, her small voice uncertain in a way that broke Maria's heart. No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong. Maria pressed a kiss to her daughter's curls, blinking back sudden tears. Sometimes grown-ups get scared, and it has nothing to do with you at all. She said it to comfort her daughter, but some small, tired part of her wondered if she needed to hear those words just as much. Over the following 2 weeks, the household staff noticed the shift, Ethan retreating back into the cold, distant rhythm he'd kept for 3 years before Sophia arrived, working later, speaking less, the fragile warmth that had briefly filled the house draining away like water through cracked stone. Vanessa, satisfied with her progress, began quietly making calls to the housekeeping agency she'd mentioned. She was a patient woman. She had learned, over years of careful maneuvering, that the surest way to remove an obstacle was never to attack it directly. It was to convince the person protecting it that removing it was their own idea. She was very close to succeeding. What she hadn't accounted for was Sophia herself, and the fact that a 3-year-old's heart, once opened, does not close quietly, or without a fight. Sophia didn't understand why Mr. Cole had stopped looking at her. She only understood that something warm had gone cold, the way the house itself seemed to grow quieter every day he pulled further away. She kept standing by the door every morning anyway. Some habits, once planted in a child's heart, don't uproot themselves just because the person on the other end stops watering them. It was on a Friday, 9 days into Ethan's retreat, that everything nearly came apart. Maria had stepped into the pantry for less than a minute. 30 seconds, maybe, when she heard the crash. Sophia had climbed onto a kitchen stool to reach a cookie jar on the counter, lost her balance, and gone down hard against the tile, the stool clattering beside her. By the time Maria reached her, Sophia was crying the way children cry when they're more frightened than hurt, a thin line of blood already welling from a cut above her eyebrow. Ethan heard it from his study down the hall. He was on his feet and moving before he'd even decided to move. 3 years of careful distance evaporating in half a second of pure animal instinct. He reached the kitchen before Maria had even finished pulling Sophia into her lap. "Let me see," he said, dropping to his knees on the tile, his $3,000 suit forgotten entirely. He tilted Sophia's chin gently, examining the cut with a steadiness that surprised even him. "It's not deep. She's going to be okay." Sophia, mid-sob, blinked up at him through wet lashes. "Mr. Cole." "I'm here," he said, and something about the way he said it, quiet, certain, present, made Maria's eyes sting. He carried Sophia to the sink himself, cleaned the small cut with a gentleness that looked like muscle memory from a life he tried to bury, found the first aid kit without being told where it was, and pressed a bandage over her eyebrow with the careful concentration of a man diffusing something far more dangerous than a scraped forehead. "There," he said softly. "Good as new." Sophia studied the bandage, then studied him. "You came," she said, like it was a small miracle worth noting out loud. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I did." It was in that moment, kneeling on his kitchen floor with a toddler's blood on his shirt cuff, that the fog Vanessa had planted in him finally began to burn away. He hadn't been protecting himself from attachment these past 2 weeks. He'd been abandoning a child who trusted him, exactly the way the world had abandoned her before. And he'd done it because a woman who claimed to love him had convinced him that walking away was healing. That night, after Maria had taken a calmer, bandaged Sophia home, Ethan sat alone in his study and, for the first time, actually looked at his phone call log with Vanessa's housekeeping agency contact. A name he didn't recognize, saved under Vanessa's account, that he'd glimpsed once by accident on a shared tablet and dismissed. He looked it up properly this time. It took him 11 minutes of calls to learn what Vanessa had already set in motion. A replacement housekeeper, background checked, and available, scheduled to start the following Monday. Maria hadn't been consulted. Maria didn't even know. Ethan sat with that for a long time, the betrayal settling into him slower than fury usually did, but sinking deeper. When Vanessa arrived for dinner 2 nights later, full of warmth and wine and the same practice concern she'd used before, Ethan was waiting for her in the study instead of the dining room. "We need to talk," he said. "Of course, darling. What's wrong?" "I know about the agency. I know you've been arranging to replace Maria without telling me, and without telling her." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it Vanessa had never heard from him before, not anger exactly, but a door closing. "I want to know why you thought that was your decision to make." Vanessa's composure flickered, just barely, before resettling. "Ethan, I did it because I love you. Because I watched you disappear into that little girl the way you disappeared into Lily's memory, and I couldn't stand by while you built another loss you weren't ready for." "You didn't do it for me," Ethan said quietly. "You did it because Sophia and Maria made you feel like you weren't the only thing in this house that mattered. And you were right. You aren't." The silence that followed was long, and cold, and final. "So that's it," Vanessa finally said, her voice sharpening. "You're choosing your housekeeper's daughter over the woman you're supposed to marry." "I'm choosing to stop lying to myself," Ethan said. "About a lot of things. Starting with this engagement." Vanessa left that night, and she did not come back quietly. There were calls to lawyers, a returned ring left pointedly on the foyer table, a version of the story whispered to certain society columns that painted Ethan as an unstable man forming strange attachments to staff. None of it moved him. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan Cole had something steadier holding him up than the walls he'd built, and it had arrived in the shape of a 3-year-old girl who refused to stop believing that someone, eventually, would come back and mean it. Ethan called Maria into his study the following morning, and for a moment, watching his careful, formal posture, she braced herself for the conversation she'd been quietly dreading for weeks. The one where he explained, kindly but firmly, that it was time for a change. "I owe you an apology," Ethan said instead. "For the last 2 weeks. For pulling away from Sophia without any explanation, and for almost letting someone push both of you out of this house because it was easier than sitting with what I was actually feeling." Maria said nothing, waiting. "I lost my wife and daughter 3 years ago," he continued, the words still difficult, still raw, but no longer unbearable to say out loud. "Sophia looks at me the way Lily used to. And I panicked, and I let someone convince me that meant something was wrong with me, instead of admitting that Sophia was the first good thing that had happened to me since the accident." "Mr. Cole, you don't have to." "I want to," he said. "I want Sophia in this house for as long as you'll have her here. Not as an arrangement. Not as staff policy. I want to actually be someone she can count on, if she'll let me try again. He paused. And I'd like the chance to know you better too, Maria. Not as my housekeeper. Just as yourself, if that's something you'd ever want. Maria's eyes filled before she could stop them, not from sadness this time, but from something she hadn't let herself hope for in a very long time. The months that followed weren't dramatic. There was no single grand gesture, no fairy tale sweep into a new life. There was, instead, something slower and sturdier, Ethan learning to leave the office by 6 most nights, Sophia's crayon dinosaurs multiplying across the refrigerator door, Maria laughing more easily in a kitchen that had once felt like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. Ethan finally repainted the nursery, not erasing Lily, but making room, gently, for whoever might need that room next. He kept the framed photograph of Claire and Lily on his desk now, in the open, instead of buried in a drawer, and some mornings he talked to it quietly before leaving for work, the way a man finally makes peace with a grief he no longer has to hide from. One morning, nearly a year after the day a tiny finger first pointed at his chest, Ethan paused by the front door on his way out, the way he always did now, and crouched down to Sophia's height. "I'll be back tonight," he said. "I promise." Sophia, no longer 3 but 4 now, looked at him with the same serious brown eyes, though something in them had softened over the year, a little more trust, a little less bracing for disappointment. "I know," she said simply, and reached up to hug him before he left, something she'd never once done in that first anxious year of watching him walk away. Ethan held onto that small, warm weight for a long moment before he let her go. He kept his promise that night. And the night after that. And every night after that, for as long as it mattered, which, as it turned out, was for the rest of both their lives.